Welcome to Way Over Our Heads. It's a climate and weather podcast. I'm Jim Dubois. With me is Kenny Blumenfeld. He's a climatologist, all-around weather enthusiast. And Kenny, here we are approaching Thanksgiving. We had a cold and wet October. Was this unusual for this time of the year?
So up in Minnesota and the upper Midwest, October especially started really wet. It sort of dried out a little bit at the end. And it was cool almost entirely throughout. There were a couple moments you'd think of as warm where temperatures were up around 80, but really the majority of the month was spent way colder than you'd normally be. We had snow in northern Minnesota in the first week of October. The northern half of Minnesota had snow by the 9th and 10th, and the rest of the state had it by the 14th. And it wasn't like the snow stuck around and we had accumulations on the ground or anything like that, but it really kind of tells you where we were. We didn't make much of a recovery, and it ended up being a really cold month.
Well, this time of the year, wild swings in temperature are not all that uncommon. Two things come to mind. One that we just experienced this past October, and then, of course, the Armistice Day blizzard of 1940. But let's go back to that first week of October when it was in the 80s. And then within about a 24-hour period, depending upon what part of the state you were in, you saw perhaps a 50-degree swing in temperature. Is that common for the fall?
We call spring and fall the transition seasons because it really transitions from what I think of as kind of destination seasons. So, if, for example, in the wintertime, it gets cold really sometime in November, December, and then it stays cold for about 3 months. And it's not to say that there isn't variability, but there's not a whole lot of difference usually between the average temperatures for, about a 50-day period in that sort of middle of winter. But if you look at a 50-day period, say between, March and May, there's a huge difference in average temperatures because you're on the way to summer. And in fall, you're on the way to winter. And the tension in that seasonal change means that we're going to see wild swings in temperature as winter begins to replace summer. And the way that you bring in a wild swing in temperature is on the wind. So what happened in early October is we got it wasn't extraordinarily warm, but we did get out in front of a low pressure system. The winds came up from the south. It got pretty humid. We got up to, again, close to 80. We got booming thunderstorms. And then right after the thunderstorms, the winds howled from the northwest and the temperatures dropped, as you said, 35, 40, 50 degrees in, really most of that change happened in about 10 hours. It was rapid. And again, that doesn't happen every year, but it's not unheard of. We've had much sharper frontal passages in the region. And again, it's most common in the fall or in the spring because of that tension between the two seasons that are, one's always replacing the other.
And those radical shifts in temperature can be life-threatening, especially if we look back some 78 years ago to the Armistice Day blizzard of 1940, and we just commemorated that anniversary. And that caught a lot of hunters unprepared, and we saw a tremendous drop in temperatures suddenly. The hunters were dressed for warm weather, and they were trapped, and some perished.
Yeah, there's a little bit of lore around that blizzard, and it doesn't need it. It was a horrendous blizzard. It was one of the most devastating in Minnesota history. It was a mass fatality event. So, it was a low pressure system. And so listeners should probably get used to this because we're going to use that term an awful lot because most of our exciting weather is associated with low pressure areas or low pressure systems. And that's where you have counterclockwise circulation around a center point where the barometric pressure is relative to other areas at its lowest. And those systems, they rotate counterclockwise, and the counterclockwise circulation in the northern hemisphere means where that circulation is pulling air up from the south, it gets warm, and where it's pulling air down from the north, it gets cold. And again, just like with those temperature transitions, a lot of the excitement is right at that gradient. And out ahead of that low, it was warm. Temperatures were really in the 50s and maybe 60s. It was
so I was pushing it. It wasn't quite summer-like.
It's okay. It was 400 degrees. No, it was, but this is the kind of thing we, as climatologists, we get this all the time. People start getting into stories and we start hearing that before the Halloween blizzard, it was 93 degrees. And we're like, nah, it wasn't. But Yeah, it was warm, and it was certainly warm enough, given what time of year it was, that people were very comfortable going outside in short sleeves and, kind of light outdoor apparel on. And one of the real tragedies was the storms came up so quickly. There were hunters on some of the islands, some of the marshy areas within the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, and especially the Mississippi River down kind of southeast of Red Wing, where a lot of hunters had taken to some of the islands in these little skiffs, these little boats that weren't very rugged. And the problem wasn't just that the weather changed. The problem was that the winds were too severe for their boats to handle the waves on the water, so they couldn't get off the islands. So now they're underdressed, underprepared for these conditions, and they had no way off. And this is where a lot of the hunters perished. It was a huge drop in temperature, so that, from 40s, 50s, and maybe low 60s to temperatures in the single digits within a matter of about 24 hours. A lot of people froze to death and then were buried in the snow. It was a major blizzard. Minnesota, the Twin Cities area had well over a foot of snow, had over 2 inches of precipitation. Roads were closed across the state. Cars were buried inside Minneapolis. It was kind of an unbelievable scene. And since you're talking about rapidly changing weather systems, one that didn't quite hit Minnesota square on the nose, but was even more remarkable, was also on the same date, November 11, and it occurred, I believe it was 1911. And in any case, temperatures in Missouri and Illinois and Wisconsin were in the 70s and 80s. And then an outbreak of tornadoes roared through, and there were some fatalities from the tornadoes. And then the temperatures dropped between 60 and 80 degrees.
Wow.
And winds were commonly 50 to 75 miles an hour, and a blizzard ensued. And from that event, there were a number of all-time temperature change records set across the Midwest. So a really remarkable system, also basically the exact same time of the year. So this is a time for very changeable weather. And of course, we saw something not quite as severe, but fairly similar in a lot of ways on Halloween of 1991, where 2 days before, as a low pressure system was approaching, it was it was relatively mild, and then the temperature dropped first to around freezing, and we got some snow, and people have forgotten that the blizzard was one story. We got 2 to 2.5 feet of snow. Parts of Minnesota got 3 feet of snow. But the next week after that, temperatures got lower earlier in the season than most stations had ever recorded. So it was also phenomenally cold in the wake of that blizzard.
One thing, too, that characterized this past October was a lot of precipitation, and that gave farmers a real challenge because they weren't able to get in to harvest their crops.
Yeah, it was wet, and it was very difficult for farmers. And we, hear this a lot. And there are times of the year where it's better to be wet, and there are times of the year where it's better to be dry. And at the end of the season, when people are trying to get in their fields and get the crops out and do the harvest, having it's so wet that your equipment barely works is a real pain point. And there was some money lost, and this actually caused some hardships. It's worth mentioning, because we don't know exactly where listeners are. We mostly talk about Minnesota and the upper Midwest. And in this particular case, the problems with wetness in Minnesota in 2018, you can almost draw a line. They go from what you think of as that hump in western Minnesota, just kind of right around that hump.
Like Ortonville, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that area's been almost right on the border.
Big Stone Lake, yeah.
And then you kind of draw a line straight up, north, northeast towards International Falls. And everything east and south of there has been anything between wet enough to too wet to way, way, way too wet. And everything on the left side or northwest of that line has really been either just below normal precipitation or in some cases even too dry. We haven't heard of major hardships from the drought or from drought-type conditions up there, but they're having a different climate situation in the northwestern part of Minnesota right now.
Well, as we approach Thanksgiving, it looks like a warm-up is on the way. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, so we've been really cold. This what's interesting, I looked at it, Jim, through the first half of the month. As cold as it's been, we're barely cracking the top 20 for coldest first halves of November. So it just shows you how soft we've gotten. I mean, can we handle anything anymore? But, you know, it has been cold, and if anyone's listening and they don't remember what we're talking about, temperatures have been frequently 10 to 20 degrees colder than what you would normally get this year. And that, when you have it for such a prolonged period, it kind of resets your thinking a little bit, and you forget, oh, it's actually supposed to be 45 today. It's instead of 27, and the lows are only supposed to be in the upper 20s instead of the teens. It does appear that the warm air is going to move in, and we're going to shift into a more mild regime as the jet stream remains a little bit farther to our north, and at least the southern part of Minnesota will benefit from some mild air and temperatures probably during much of Thanksgiving week and the following weekend into the, at least the 30s and 40s, if not, possibly some nudges towards 50 in, extreme southern and western parts of the state.
Well, shifting gears a bit here, Kenny, you just attended a climate conference at the University of Minnesota. Tell us about that.
So this was the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. They have a conference roughly every year, and this was organized by the Water Resources Center, but most of the participants are not affiliated with the University of Minnesota. Basically, that's just kind of the pivot point. It's a really neat organization. I've been lucky to be involved in both the program and also the awards committee. But, climate adaptation is a smart strategy for dealing with both the climate that you already have and also the climate that is on its way or is already undergoing changes. And so, when you think about the changing climate in Minnesota, as you know, there's a variety of management approaches. How do you deal with it? And the one that's the most contentious is what everyone talks about, is when you're talking about limiting greenhouse gas emissions or taxing carbon, and that gets at mitigating further changes or preventing further changes to the climate system. There's another branch of managing the changes that's adaptation, and that's basically, how do we cope with it? How do we become more resilient? How do we strengthen the communities we have in the face of the climate? And that seems to reach a wider audience because it's here and now, and I don't think the two should be opposed to each other, but there seems to be a decent amount of energy from the scale of small communities all the way up to large organizations, where we'd like to know how we're vulnerable to the climate, and we'd like to know what we can do to be ready for it or to prepare for it or to make ourselves as strong as possible in the face of it. And so a lot of the participants are there sharing information or gathering information that would be beneficial to their own interests.
Well, let's shift gears again and talk about what we can expect for winter. Speaking of warming, we're going to have a warmer than normal winter, more than likely. Correct, Kenny?
Probably. I mean, who knows? We should revisit it afterwards and grade that forecast. But, generally, the trend anyways has been that about 7 out of 10 winters in the upper Midwest are warmer than the most recent averages that were calculated. So we already have just the trends for warming kind of on our side, but throw in the fact that we do expect an El Nino. An El Nino is a warming of the water in the equatorial Pacific region, so near the equator, in the especially eastern half of the Pacific Ocean, and that affects the circulation. And when we see an El Nino event, it tends to bring warmer winters too, with about 70 to 75% frequency. So 75% of the El Nino winters are warm. 75% of winters in general in the upper Midwest have been warm. So that's a pretty good convergence of information saying we should be warm this winter. But, you still got a fighting chance of having a real winter in there. But some of the long-range models that I am not endorsing because they don't seem to work all that well in resolving the actual weather, but they do pick up on trends in the system at sort of a deeper level. And some of those long-range models are saying that, by the time we get into early and mid-December, we're going to be really mild, maybe as much above normal as we have been below normal in early November. And there's no real sign that that pattern breaks. So, again, we can't give a lot of detail. Who knows? Maybe we'll get one cold week or one big snowstorm, but it looks like a warmer winter.
When we talk about weather and climate, we have to talk about the human effects that it takes. And we know that weather can be a very personal thing. If you are impacted by it, such as the California wildfires that are going on now, it becomes a tragedy. Let's talk about the wildfires a bit, Kenny. Unprecedented wildfires in California. We know that the death toll is growing every day. There are 1,000 some people who are unaccounted for. What has caused these wildfires, and to what extent is climate change to blame?
Oof, good questions, all of them. So, I mean, the main thing that causes a wildfire is you have to have fuel. And in the forest fires and in wildland fires, the fuel is vegetation. Anything that's, on the land that is dry and has had the moisture wrung out of it becomes a fuel. Just like, if you're building a fire, you're not looking for wet wood. You're looking for nice, dry tinder and kindling. And that's unfortunately exactly what's been happening in California. They've had a prolonged drought for much of this decade. And there was a wet interlude to that drought, I think it was 2 winters ago. But it's really been primarily a drought, and it's been severe. And it has been in many cases beyond anything that modern records and even some of the paleological records have indicated in terms of severity. So it seems to stand out as a singularity. And in terms of the changing climate, there is a lot of evidence that arid areas will get and are getting more arid. California has pronounced wet and dry seasons, and the dry seasons seem to be drier, and they're also a bit warmer, which lowers the average relative humidity, which then makes it easier for the air to pull moisture out of whatever vegetation lies dormant on the ground. On top of that, you have a non-climatic factor, which is people moving into and establishing communities in fairly vulnerable areas. That's a human factor that isn't directly related to the climate. It's related to our patterns of settlement, and that people like to, have a nice piece of nature all to themselves, or they like to live in a community where they can see trees and nature around them. And cities that are on that interface with the wildland areas are especially vulnerable in places like California, because fires are really common in California, and now you're kind of putting communities into fire belts. But I think all of those dynamics together would never have led anyone to predict, Jim, that an entire city of 27,000 people would be leveled to the ground. I mean, there's very little left. I mean, the question, of course, is going to be, do we rebuild, and do we rebuild here? And the reason that second part of that question matters is because there really isn't anything other than, the streets.
Right. It's complete devastation.
I mean,
if you see the aerial photographs, it's sobering. It's amazing.
We haven't seen tornadoes or hurricanes do this kind of damage. And in places like Minnesota, I guess we have Hinckley and we have Cloquet.
Right.
As 100-year-old examples of how destructive fire can be. But nationally, we haven't really seen this. And you're right, we don't know what the death toll is because there's so many things that haven't been accounted for. But this is a scale of devastation that we've just never seen. And I think it would be naive to say that this doesn't have anything to do with the climate changing. And it would also be a little bit probably be irresponsible to lump everything going on there on the climate too, and maybe take a good look at how we build and where we build and the choices that we're making, because there's human involvement here that goes beyond what we emit into the atmosphere.
Right.
And the decisions that we make about where we live and how we live are really important. And what are we entitled to? I think, again, we keep saying we need to have a hard conversation. Well, it's time. Let's do it.
Right.
We got to do this.
The sense of urgency is here.
Yeah, it was a real tragedy, and I've never seen anything like that. I talked to my colleagues about this, and we don't have any examples of a city, a city completely vanishing. It's just something we've never seen before. And it's right in the most populated state and one of the wealthy states in our very wealthy country. The fact that this happened is just unbelievable.
Well, it's another great example of how weather can impact history and take a tremendous human toll.
Yeah. Well, Jim, you have some kind of personal connection to other historically significant weather events. Don't you have a story involving your father in World War II?
Yes. The Washington Post had an article 3 years ago The headline, How Typhoons at the End of World War II Swamped U.S. Ships and Nearly Saved Japan from Defeat. Now, that might be a bit overboard, but just for a brief history, it was a great eye-catching headline, no doubt about that. Great clickbait, as they say. But just from a historical perspective, obviously, 1945, Victory in Japan Day, 2 atomic bombs were dropped by the U.S. on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And those bombs are largely credited with negating the necessity of the U.S. to launch an invasion of the Japanese mainland. There was a plan afoot, actually a couple of plans. There would be 2 waves of invasion by the U.S. and its allies of the mainland, one in late 1945, the other in the spring of 1946. So the personal side of this is my dad was in the U.S. Army Signal Corps and was stationed on a ship in the Pacific Ocean near the Japanese islands, and his mission would have been to support the invasions. But a couple of entries from a journal he kept, Buckner Bay, Okinawa, talks about these typhoons. So here's an entry, hot sun, clear day, clouded toward the evening, typhoon taking path in half circle, sweeping toward Okinawa at 0800 near Luzon. May spend itself toward the China coast. Refueled today about 1700, no mail today. The next day, sky lowering and overcast, typhoon coming up from the Philippines. Sea in the bay getting rough at 10:05 out to sea to ride out the typhoon. By noon, heavy sea and wind, 2000 hours, waves 60 to 75 foot waves. Ship rolling heavily, wind velocity between 80 and 90 knots. That's a pretty strong wind. Driving rain. 6 men swept overboard on tanker off starboard bow. No hope of saving them. Stood on the super deck, starboard gun mount, and watched the typhoon from 1800 to 2100. Wonderful spectacle of the awful power of the elements. Always majestic, but sometimes frightening. China's Sea will never be forgotten.
Yeah, that is, well, I mean, at first when Dad's estimating the winds, I'm thinking, no. And then he says 6 men swept off the ship. Wow, that is unbelievable that he witnessed that.
Yeah, it's awesome power, and why weather is so fascinating and sometimes so incredibly frightening. Well, today we talked about a number of things. We talked about the weather in October and November. We talked about historical blizzards. We talked about the wildfires in California. We also talked about how sometimes weather can alter the course of history and make experiences very, very personal. Coming up next week, a look at the very dire United Nations climate report that came out in October. Kenny, always a pleasure talking with you, and we'll see you next week, and have a great Thanksgiving.
Thanks. You also, Jim.